C.H. Spurgeon's Autobiography, Chapter 39. First, literary friends. I was reading, some time ago, an article in the newspaper very much in my praise. It always makes me sad, so sad that I could cry. If ever I see anything praising me, it breaks my heart. I feel I do not deserve it. And then I say, now I must try and be better, so that I may deserve it. If the world abuses me, I am a match for that. I begin to like it. It may fire all its big guns at me. I will not return a solitary shot, but just store them up and grow rich upon the old iron. All the abuse it likes to heap upon me I can stand. But when a man praises me, I feel it is a poor thing I have done, and that he commends what does not deserve commendation. This crushes me down, and I say to myself, I must set to work and deserve this. I must preach better. I must be more earnest and more diligent in my master's service. C.H.S. Although many assailed Mr. Spurgeon through the press, in the first years of his ministry in London, there were always loyal and true hearts ready to come to his help and write in his defense. This chapter and the next contain the principal favorable articles published during 1855 and 1856. They furnish a marked contrast to the slanders and calamities which the young preacher had to endure at that time. One of the earliest encouraging notices appeared appropriately in The Friend and was supplied by a member of the Society of Friends. The writer said, an extraordinary sensation has recently been produced in London by the preaching of a young Baptist minister named C.H. Spurgeon. The crowds which have been drawn to hear him, the interest excited by his ministry, and the conflicting opinions expressed in reference to his qualifications and usefulness have been altogether without parallel in modern times. What renders the present case remarkable is the juvenility of the preacher, his hold on the public being established before he has attained his 20th year, and his first appearance in London being that of a country youth, without any of the supposed advantages of a college education or ordained ministerial training. Early in 1854, he undertook the charge of the Congregational Assembling in the New Park Street Chapel southward. It was a remarkable sight to see this round-faced country youth thus placed in a position of such solemn and arduous responsibility, yet addressing himself to the fullness of its wondrous duties with a gravity, self-possession, and vigor that proved him well fitted to the task he had assumed. In a few weeks, the pews, which had been so long tenantless, were crowded. Every sitting in the chapel was let, and ere many months had elapsed, the eagerness to hear him had become so great that every standing place in the chapel walls was occupied on each succeeding Sabbath, and it became evident that increased accommodations must be provided for the wants of the congregation. It was about this period in the autumn of 1854 that we first heard C.H. Spurgeon on the occasion of his preaching to the Young Men's Christian Association. The preliminary portions of the service were conducted in a manner at once to impress the hearer with a sense of the earnest reverency which the young pastor felt in his work. He read a portion of Scripture, accompanying it with a few forcible and pointed remarks, these expository efforts being of peculiar value to the class of hearers of which his congregations are mostly composed. His sermon was a deeply impressive one. He spoke as a young man to young men, sympathizing in their tastes, their trials, their temptations, and their wants. He unfolded the plan of salvation and urged the importance of a manly and decided profession of Christianity. One of the first and one of the ablest of Mr. Spurgeon's champions among literary men was Mr. James Grant, the editor of the Morning Advertiser, which under his management, a contemporary writer testifies, was raised to the position of a first-class morning paper, second only to the Times, either in circulation or influence. In its columns, on February 19, 1855, he published an article, the tenure of which may be judged by the following extracts. The Reverend Mr. Spurgeon, a young man in the 21st year of his age, had just appeared under this name among our metropolitan preachers and is creating a great sensation in the religious world. He had only been a few weeks settled as minister of Park Street Chapel, Southwark, before that commodious place was filled to overflowing with hundreds at each service went away who were unable to effect an entrance. The result was that it was agreed to enlarge the chapel and that the youthful minister should preach in the large room of Exeter Hall for 8 Sundays until the reopening of his own place of worship. It will easily be believed how great must be the popularity of this almost boyish preacher when we mention that yesterday, both morning and evening, the large hall, capable of containing from 4,000 to 5,000 persons, was filled in every part. Mr. Spurgeon belongs to the Baptist denomination. He is short in stature and somewhat thickly built, which, with an exceeding broad, massive face, gives him the appearance of a man 26 or 27 years of age instead of 21. His doctrines are of the hyper-Calvinist school. He is a young man, we are told, of extensive information, especially on theological subjects, and of a highly cultivated mind. There can be no doubt that he possesses superior talents, while in some of his happier flights he rises to a higher order of pulpit oratory. It is in pathos that he excels, though he does not himself seem to be aware of the fact. But for some sad drawbacks in the young divine, we should anticipate great usefulness from him, because he not only possesses qualities particularly adapted to attract and rivet the attention of the masses, but he makes faithful and powerful appeals to the consciences of the unconverted. In the spirit of sincere friendship, we would advise him to study to exhibit an aspect of greater gravity and seriousness. Let us also impress upon him the indispensable necessity of relinquishing those theatrical, we have almost said melodramatic attitudes into which he is in the habit of throwing himself. In Exeter Hall yesterday, instead of confining himself to the little spot converted into sort of a pulpit for him, he walked about on the platform just as if he had been treading the boards of Drury Lane Theatre while performing some exciting tragedy. Altogether, he seems to want the reverency of manner, which is essential to the success of a minister of the gospel. Footnote. In the Autobiography, Volume 1, page 353, a quotation is given from the remembrances of Professor Everett, who had been Mr. Spurgeon's fellow tutor at Newmarket. Soon after the young pastor's settlement at New Park Street Chapel, he invited his former colleague to pay him a visit. During the conversation, Mr. Everett referenced to this supposed irreverency, and recalling the interview in 1892, he wrote, "I remember suggesting to him in this connection that a man ought to feel and show some sense of awe in the presence of his master, and his reply was to the effect that awe was foreign to his nature, that he felt perfectly at home with his Heavenly Father." End of the footnote. We hope, however, that in these respects he will improve. It is with the view we give him our friendly counsels. He is quite an original preacher, and therefore will always draw large congregations, and consequently may be eminently made the means of doing great good to classes of persons who might never otherwise be brought within the sound of a faithfully preached gospel. He has evidently made George Whitefield his model, and like that unparalleled preacher, that prince of pulpit orators is very fond of striking hypertrophies. Like him, too, he has a powerful voice which would at times be more pleasing and not less impressive were it not raised to so high a pitch. Mr. Spurgeon's own testimony confirms Mr. Grant's assertion that he had evidently made George Whitefield his model. He wrote in 1879, "There is no end to the interest which attracts to such a man as George Whitefield. Often as I have read his life, I am conscious of distant quickening. Whenever I turn to it, he lived. Other men seem to be only half alive, but Whitefield was all life, fire, wing, force. My own model, if I may have such a thing in due subordinates to my Lord, is George Whitefield. But with unequal footsteps must I follow in his glorious tracks." Mr. Grant's article was reprinted in the March number of the Baptist Messenger, which was originated and, until his death, edited by Reverend Jonathan Whitmore of EYNSFORD, who had in the autumn of 1854 availed himself of Mr. Spurgeon's literary assistance and so commended a connection with the magazine which had continued to the present day. In the meantime, the correspondence referred to in the previous chapter was being published, and consequently the April issue of the Messenger, as it was usually termed, contained several of the most friendly letters, together with the following article on Mr. Spurgeon and his distractors. It is not at all a matter of surprise that the extraordinary popularity of this estimable young minister should have evoked censure and commendation of all kinds and degrees. The pulpit and the forum alike invite attention and challenge criticism, and so long as this test is legitimately and truthfully applied, no public character, if right-hearted, will shrink from its decisions. But if the criticism be made the vehicle of calamity, and if the censors of the press instead of employing their pens in commending excellency or in censoring and correcting faults, however severely, if fairly done, seek by distraction of falsehood to damage the reputation and lessen the usefulness of those whose efforts they decry, then do they degrade an otherwise honorable occupation into that of a dirty, despicable slanderer. Several of Mr. Spurgeon's critics, we regret to say, have thus disgraced themselves. If they have not originated, they have given a wide circulation to fabrications as grossly absurd as they are totally false. By Mrs. S., however, these falsehoods are treated with no other feelings than those of pity for the individuals with whom they are emmanuated. It was thus a century ago with the seraphim-tongued Whitfield, to whom, by some of his more friendly critics, Mr. Spurgeon has been compared. We have been introduced to make this reference to those attacks upon Mr. Spurgeon, not more from the circumstance that we are favorably monthly with his valuable contributions to our pages, than from the high and honorable position in which it has pleased the great head of the church to place him, in which it should be the aim of all who love Zion to uphold and encourage his youthful and gifted brother, and also because we have had put into our hands by a party altogether disinterested the following correspondence, a portion of which is addressed to a providential paper, which had been made the medium of circulating slanderous reports containing Mr. S., to whom it is but fair to state the editor of the paper referred to has made ample and satisfactory apology. In the June number of the Baptist Messenger, the editor wrote, several articles and extracts from providential papers condemnatory of the Reverend C.H. Spurgeon have been forwarded for inspection in the Messenger. This, however, we must decline doing. It is indeed most pitiful that this excellent and useful servant of Christ cannot go about his master's business quietly and unobtrusively, for his popularity is altogether unsought by him, without exciting unkind and envious remarks. In the quotation from Mr. Spurgeon's letter given on page 26, there is an allusion to a growing account of his life and work, which has been published in The Patriot on September 21st, 1855. The following are some of the writer's kind expressions concerning the young preacher. Although the name of the Reverend C.H. Spurgeon has been frequently mentioned in the columns of his journal, we have not introduced him to our readers by any formal description of his preaching. Such, however, is its effect, that curiosity cannot but have been awakened by intelligence of the immense crowds collected to hear him while occupying Exeter Hall from Sunday to Sunday, and also when he returned to his own enlarged chapel in New Park Street over Southwark Bridge. There must surely be something extraordinary in a mere youth who could command an audience of from 10 to 12,000 persons in an open field, and who, on visiting the North, though received with cold suspicion at first, soon compelled the fixed and admiring attention of the reluctant Scot. Though, he says, they seem to be all made of lumps of ice fetched from Windham Lake. Those who go to hear Mr. Spurgeon inquiring, what will this babbler say, are not long left in doubt as to either the manner or the matter of his discourses. We have heard ourselves Mr. Spurgeon but once, And on that occasion, not having succeeded in gaining an entrance into the chapel, we squeezed ourselves into a side vestry from which the speaker could be heard but not seen. We found him neither extravagant nor extraordinary. His voice is clear and musical. His language is plain. His style flowing, yet terse. His method lucid and orderly. His matter sound and suitable. His tone and spirit cordial. His remarks always pithy and pungent, sometimes familiar and sometimes not. Yet never light or coarse, never less profane. Judging from this single sermon, we suppose that he would become a plain, faithful, forcible, and affectionate preacher of the gospel in the form called Calvinistic. And our judgment was the more favorable because, while there was a solidarity beyond his years, we detected little of the wild, luxurious nature characteristic of very young preachers. Our opinion of Mr. Spurgeon as a preacher has been somewhat modified by a pursuit of his published discourses, which, issued in a cheap form, appear to be bought up with great eagerness. These show him to be a more extraordinary person than we supposed, and not to be quite so far from extravagant as we thought him. But it is more for the sake of information than with the view of criticism that we refer to the subject. From whatsoever cause it springs, whether from force of native character or from a vigor superinduced upon that basic by the grace of God, there is that in Mr. Spurgeon's reported sermons which marks him a superior man. Models of different styles of preaching are so numerous that originality must be of a rare occurrency, but he appears to be an original genius. To the pith of Jay and to the plainness of Rowland Hill, he adds much of the familiarity, not to say the coarseness of the Huntingtonite order of an ultra-conservative preacher. It has been my privilege, he says, to give more prominence in the religious world to those old doctrines of the gospel. But the tracts referred to present themselves in shapes and with accompaniments which forbid the notion of imitation and favor the opinion of a peculiar bent. Neither in the style and structure nor in handling is there appearance of art, study, or elaboration. Yet each discourse has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the subject is duly introduced and stated, divided and discussed, enforced and applied. That all is done without effort and with the ease and freedom of common conversation, and with the artlessness, but also with the force of spontaneous in expression. Mr. Spurgeon waits for nothing which requires what we understand by composition, and he rejects nothing by which attention may be arrested, interest sustained, and impression made permanent. The vehicle of his thoughts is constructed of well-seasoned Saxon speech, and they are conveyed to the hearer's mind in terms highly pictorial and often vividly dramatic. Great governing principles are freely personified in religious experience, past, present, and future, appears in lifelike action upon the scene. Tried by such tests as the United, Mr. Spurgeon might sometimes be found wanting. But it is enough for him that as face answers to face in the glass, so do his words elicit a response in the hearts of those who hear him. This end secured, what cares he for a mixed metaphor or a rhetoric anachronism? Anachronism. Where it his aim to rival the Melvilles and the Harrises of the day, he lacks neither the talent nor the taste. And with these he has the faculty of gathering what is to be learned from men or from books, and of turning all to account. But his single aim is to preach the gospel, and he depends for success not upon the enticing words of man's wisdom, but upon the influence of the Spirit of God, and with a view to that, the prayers of his people. Mr. Spurgeon evinces much attitude in borrowing illustrations not only from the pages of antiquity, but from modern life and literature, but also from the most familiar incidences, as well as from popular public events. Thus the war suggests to him the idea that even the believer carries with him a bombshell ready to burst at the slightest spark of temptation. In like manner, the fatal exposure of the officer to the sharpshooting of the enemy furnishes him with a comparison by which to illustrate the peculiar liability of Christian ministers to hostile attack. though with a great difference in the result. Some of us, he says, are the officers of God's regiment, and we are the mark of all the riflemen of the enemy. Standing forward, we have to bear all the shots. What a mercy it is that not one of God's officers ever falls in battle. God always keeps them. His sermon abounds with aphoristic and pointed sayings, which often afford a striking proof of his genius. Many instances might easily be given of a force and beauty of language indicative of a high degree of elegancy. Bright-eyed cheerfulness and airy-footed love are fine phrases. Winter is described as not killing the flowers, but as coating them with the ermine of its snows. Again, the sun is not quenched, but it is behind the clouds brewing up summer. And when he cometh forth again, he will have made those clouds fit to drop in April showers, all of them mothers of the sweet-made flowers. God puts our prayers like rose leaves between the pages of his book of remembrances, and when the volume is opened at last, there shall be a precious fragrance springing up therefrom. There is one thing, the sinner is told, that doth outstrip the telegraph. Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear. The memory infected by the fall is described as suffering the glorious timbers from the forest of Lebanon to swim down the stream of oblivion, but she stoppeth all the draught that floateth from the foul city of Sodom. What quaintness, yet with force and truth, the caste feeling of society is hit off. In England, a sovereign will not speak to a shilling will not notice a sixpence, and a sixpence will sneer at a penny. A singular quaintness and vigor may be remarked in Mr. Spurgeon's diction, as when he speaks of the lightning splitting the clouds and renting the heavens, and of the mighty hand wherein the callow comets are brooded by the sun, and of the very spheres stopping their music while God speaks with his wondrous bass voice. The manly tone of Mr. Spurgeon's mind might be illustrated from the admirable thoughts which he expresses on the connection between the diffusion of the gospel and the increase of civil liberty. His graphic skill in delineating character might be demonstrated from his life-like pictures of the prejudiced Jew and the scoffing Greek of modern times. His unsparing fidelity from the sarcastic sincerity with which he rebukes the neglect of the Bible by modern professors, its powers of personification and dramatic presentation. His powers of personification and dramatic presentation from the scene which he paints between the dying Christian and death, or between Jesus and justice and the justified sinner. His redefined skill in the treatment of a delicate subject, in the veiled yet impressive description of the trial of Joseph, the use that he can make of a single metaphor by his powerful comparison of a sinner to Mazeppa, bound on the wild horse of his lust, galloping on with hell's wolves behind him till stalked and liberated by a mighty hand. Their sermon, entitled The People's Christ, contained a very striking description of the resurrection of our Lord. In that on the eternal home, the contrast between the dying thief before and after his conversion is powerfully drawn. The rage of Satan on the rescue of the sinner from his grasp forms a picture of terrified grandeur. In the sermon on the Bible, the respective characteristics of the holy penman are sketched with a masterfully comprehensive of their peculiarities and command of words. The beautiful sermon on the words, so he giveth his beloved sleep, exhibits a variety and force which stamp the master. End of chapter 39, having been read by Peter John Parisi, also known as Brian Dean from Linden, Michigan. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God.